For this week's lesson, we're going to step outside of the art of Europe that we've been looking at primarily in this course, and we're going to delve into the art of the Islamic culture. Now, we could also look at Japanese, Chinese, and Indian art of the same time period, which would be about the first 1500 years after the turn of the millennium. They all had vibrant cultures with incredible art. But that is just too much for us to study in the time period allowed. So we're going to focus on Islamic art and architecture. But before we do that, what about the rest of the world? As Europe broke into separate feudal states and the force of the individual expression became less important after the fall of the Roman Empire, the rest of the world was going through great cultural evolution. In southern India, there was a culture called the Gupta people. They developed great cities with universities, hospitals, and a very advanced culture. At the same time, China went through 4 major dynasties. And in Japan, the people unified and defined themselves as a political institution. This allowed for commercial, intellectual, scientific, and religious exchange. Along with Christianity, we had the spread of Buddhism and the beginnings of Islam. The great explorer Marco Polo set off around the year 1200 to journey from Baghdad to the China Sea. He came home back to Europe and he wrote Description of the World. And this book sparked interest, a wide interest in the world beyond the boundaries of feudal Europe. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Crusades spread European influence all across the Middle East. And yet it was Islamic scholars that preserved ancient Greek and Roman literature and philosophy so that we can study it today. Here we have a couple of images that are from the rest of the world, beyond Islamic cultures and Christian societies. And on the right we have an image of a monk from Japan. It's kind of hard to see. But in this tradition, one says the name of the Buddha or a sacred phrase constantly in what they call a mantra, which is a prayer. So what this artist has chosen to do here is to be very literal. So coming out of the mouth of this monk are a bunch of little Buddhas. So that monk is really doing his practice well, I guess you could say. And below we have a painting of bamboo from a Chinese scroll. And what's significant about this is the brushwork, is the immediacy of the line. So in other words, the artist would not have toiled over a line. He would have made one stroke, and that would have been that. Now that we've looked a little bit at the rest of the world, we're going to go back and study the art, architecture, and a little bit of the history of Islamic society. Islam arose in 7th century Arabia. This was a land of desert oases with really no cities of great size, and it was sparsely inhabited by tribal nomads. Yet under the leadership of the founder of Islam, who was the Prophet Muhammad, and his successors, Islam spread rapidly throughout northern Africa, southern and eastern Europe, and into Asia, gaining territory and converts with astonishing speed. Because Islam encompassed geographical areas with a variety of established cultural traditions, and because it admitted a diverse range of people among its converts, it absorbed and combined many different techniques and ideas about art and architecture. The result was a remarkably sophisticated artistic tradition. Now, Muslims believe that in the desert outside of Mecca, in the year 610, Muhammad received revelations that led him to found the religion called Islam. Now, many powerful Meccans were hostile to the message preached by this young visionary. And in 622, he and his companions fled to nearby Medina. It was there that Muhammad built a house that became a gathering place for the converted, and this was actually the first mosque. Muslims date their history as beginning with this emigration. Now, if you look at the map, we can see how the spread of Islam worked. So the dark green represents the expansion of Islam under Muhammad. So we have here, and I think there's a little bit over here. All right. So the lighter green is the expansion of Islam to the year 650. Now you'll note this is just a little bit less than 20 years after the death of Muhammad. And this is wild. Look at all this new territory that by and large converted to Islam in just a few years. And then we have the expansion of Islam to the year 850, which is over in these kind of a medium paler green areas. Now, if we look down here in the insert, this was the range of Islam where Islam had spread to by the year 1475. Well, and as you look closely, it's no longer prevalent in Europe, but it has expanded quite a bit down into Africa. So by and large, the point of this map is to show that over really a very brief period of time, Islam spread to cover a lot of territory. What we'll be looking at as we look at the art and architecture is the deep cultural heritage that encompasses Islam, that is a part of Islam. And that heritage is so varied because of the wide variety of backgrounds of the people that converted to Islam during this time. In the year 630, just a few years before the death of Muhammad, he returned to the city of Mecca with an army of 10,000 and routed out those that opposed him. Then he went to what is called the Kaaba. Now we're looking at the Kaaba here. And the Kaaba was said to be built by Abraham and Ishmael as a shrine to God. And it's been the focus of worship for since way before the time of Muhammad, by people who had polytheistic religions, by a wide variety of people who considered this a sacred site. But what Muhammad did was he dedicated this site for Islam, and it has become since then the holiest shrine in the religion. In fact, all over the world, when Muslims go to pray, they turn towards this site in the direction of Mecca. And part of the requirements of the faithful is to make a pilgrimage to this site at least once in their lifetime. So what it basically is a cube of stone covered with cloth that's considered to be one of the holiest sites in the world. Now that we've talked a little bit about the history, we're going to briefly run through some of the techniques. And these can also be found on page 268 in your textbook. Now, one of the notable features of Islamic art and architecture is the patterning, is the repetition of pattern and the intricate tile work and mosaic work. So here we have an example of that called a block masonry. And in this technique, you can see that different colors of stone are put together to create an elaborate pattern. Next up we have, I believe it's tile work, ornament tile cut. So this is when these tiles are created to fit into a certain size and space, and they're crafted that way, and then all these different size tiles are put together. It's like a mosaic, except that there's more planning from the tile end. In other words, the tiles are created to fit together in this very specific way. Now this one is muqarna, and it's very interesting because they kind of look like stalactites and stalagmites. But what the artists do here is they take the plaster and they sort of hang it from the support. It also reminds me of a beehive, of honeycomb in a beehive. And this, to me, is sort of an ornamentation taken to an extreme. Wooden strap work. This is a lovely way, and it's very time-consuming. And one of the interesting things to note about this is how symmetrical the patterns are. So that when the artist is actually cutting out these thin pieces of wood, they need it to match both sides, which would make it all the more challenging. So in this technique, wood is cut very thinly and then is made to look as if it's even sort of woven together, as you see in the lines that have the white and the dark. And here we have mosaic, which we've already looked at in the Roman and the Greek times, especially with the Romans. They loved the mosaic. And here you can see tiles are used also to create a design, but it's more small pieces of tile that are put together to create colors and patterns and thus the design. And lastly, most importantly, we have water. Water is a feature at pretty much all mosques because the act of washing before prayer is an integral part of the prayer ritual. Now, if you think about this in context, it makes perfect sense. Where in the world, in the desert, are you going to be able to wash? So if it's written into the prayer ritual that one washes in a certain prescribed way, which includes cleaning the mouth and the nostrils and very complete cleaning with water, well, then it makes sense that the society as a whole is going to be a lot cleaner. Also, it makes sense for the mosques because the worshipers can wash the dust off before they come in to pray. Well, here's one more that I didn't realize we had one more, and here it is. This one's called Chini Kana, and what I like about this is it almost sounds like china cabinet, and what the term literally means is kitchen cabinet. What this technique is the cutting of little pockets, little cutouts in a wall, and sometimes these little cutouts had things placed in them, or other times, as we see here, it's just done for the sake of ornamentation. So what this is little windows sort of cut in a wall in order to create a pattern. Now that we've looked at the details, let's go to the general a little bit and talk about mosques. Now, a mosque literally means a place of prostration. In Islam, congregants gather in a meeting place for regular prayers, and they believe that there's no real intermediary between them and the source or God or whatever you want to call it, but the imam really just presides over the gathering, ideally as more of a functionary. In the time of Muhammad, he actually lived pretty simply, and he instructed his followers at his home, which had a central courtyard and had his living quarters along one side of the courtyard. On the other side, there was a kind of a low platform where he could stand on to speak to the followers that were there, and then a niche in the wall which faced towards Mecca. And this is really the pattern that all the mosques that have been built since then have followed. However, they've gotten ever more elaborate. So in early Islam, there were a couple of centers of great power. One of them was Damascus in Syria, and the other one was in Baghdad. Now that's kind of interesting to note, because how do we know those cities today? Both these cities are in places that there is extreme conflict in the world today. Now that's interesting that they were both central to the early spread of Islam. Now let's talk about the Dome of the Rock. It's built in Jerusalem on a rocky outcropping that is sacred to all three of the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And yet in the year 691, this shrine was built. It was built by Byzantine architects, but is definitely a Muslim shrine. Now this kind of reflects the view of early Islam that Muhammad was the last true prophet and that their religion superseded the other religions. Now, needless to say, this didn't go over all that well, but here we have the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and it's a beautiful, beautiful building. So let's look inside. Here we have the interior, and this is a great example of the ornate Islamic architecture, and yet the shrine itself is built on the round plan from Byzantine architecture, so we can see Christian influence as well as many other influences here in the interior of it's really one of the holiest shrines in all three religions. So now let's pop over to southern Spain. The Moors invaded southern Spain from North Africa. And here we have the great mosque at Cordoba. Such a beautiful structure. If you just look at it for the structure itself, the rhythmic way that the arches go together, I mean, it's really spectacular. And here we have the dome in front of the mihrab at the great mosque. Well, this is going to end this part of the recording, and we'll finish in part 2.